This video is going to be a quick analysis on the combat system of the game Control, which is a third-person shooter made by Remedy Entertainment. And although I do quite enjoy the game, I think there are some things that could be improved. But first, I'll start talking a bit about the things I find that are very good. When I think of Control's combat, the first thing I think about is the launch mechanic, which is essential to everything inside Control. This mechanic allows players to essentially grab objects using the protagonist's telekinetic powers and then throw those objects at basically everything they want. It is especially fun to use in combat because since you grab items of different types of weight and properties like explosions, sending them flying to enemies never gets old. And since you can use essentially everything the environment has, you always are looking for ways to, let's say, grab the best thing around to hit enemies, or maybe position yourself in a way that when you grab an item, it comes flying, hitting several enemies, and then you throw it back at them. So it feels very natural and fun to use. The combat itself feels very frantic and fast paced in a fun way because the player has a lot of good movement options. For instance, the levitation power adds a new degree of verticality to encounters, which I think is very fun. And the evade mechanic feels very satisfying to use. And I love the way they balance it because evade uses the same, let's say, research, which is energy, as launch. So you cannot be simply spamming evade all the time or spamming launch. You have to actually alternate between them in let's say an offense and defensive mindset. And I think that adds a lot of decision making in the moment to moment gameplay, which is, I think it's very fun. I also love how the game constantly forces the player to be constantly moving instead of just staying behind cover. And this is because Jesse, as a character, receives a lot of damage. So if you really want to, let's say, regain health, the health pickups are just dropped by the enemy. So you have to be constantly moving towards a position where they die to actually regain health. And that forces you to be constantly on your toes. And I think that adds to the momentum of the gameplay. And I think it's very fun. As for the things I dislike about Control's combat, the first one is the launch mechanic, ironically. And although it feels very good to use, as I previously said, especially late game, it becomes so overpowered that basically you can solve any encounter just spamming launch. And that coupled with the fact that the service weapon that the character has, which is essentially the guns they use, are not very impactful or not really very effective against enemies. That means that the whole strategy you will have is just to spam launch until your energy depletes, and then you will try to basically empty your gun until you essentially have enough energy to keep spamming launch. And I think that is not very fun because it's very repetitive in the end. I also did not enjoy the fact that you essentially have five weapons, six if you count the DLC, and two of them are very redundant, and that is the shotgun and the machine gun. And those two weapons essentially work very good in close quarter encounters. But since you already have launch, which is very good at that type of encounter, and you have a melee attack, and I think you have another ability which allows you to bull rush your enemies, I don't see why you would ever use those two weapons that feel very similar. I think it was kind of a wasted spot for another weapon that could have been more interesting. Another problem for me was the enemy design that is not very interesting because the enemies do not encourage the player to take different approaches to beating them. This is because, as I said before, the launch mechanic is so good. And I do know that there are some things like the shields in the enemies that supposedly are weak against launch, and then when you have normal health, the service weapon is better. But in the end, that is not the case because, as I said before, launch just beats everything. So I think that was kind of a missed opportunity. As for possible solutions to these issues, they would of course require a lot of playtesting, but I would start by probably reworking some of the weapons. For instance, the machine gun would probably be better reworked as a weapon that works better medium range, like a type of laser that the more you focus it on an enemy, the more damage it does. That could be a good example. And I would also buff the weapons overall. so that they won't become essentially useless late game. As for the enemies, I would start by first reworking the shields. Um, I will try to get them to work the way the developers intended, in the sense that the launch is very good against shields and the gun is very good against normal health, so that you could go back and forth alternating between your gun and the launch mechanic, which I personally wouldn't change too much. The launch mechanic, I mean, because I think it feels very good to use. However, coming back to the enemies, I would also try to create behaviors that are more interesting. Maybe they could cooperate between them, or I would look for ways that invite the player to approach these encounters in a more varied way, that motivate them, for instance, to use all the weapons. And I think this could be accomplished by making it so that certain enemies are more susceptible to certain weapons, like for instance, enemies with armor, that you need to use the pierce weapon that works as a charge rifle, for example, would be a very good example of this. And for this to work, one thing in the game would have to change, and that would be the way you change your weapons, because in the current state of control, you need to pause the game and then select the weapon you want to use. And I would rework this in, let's say, a way similar to, for instance, GTA, in the sense that you have a weapon wheel, so that you could change between weapons mid encounter really fast. And I think that could add a lot of variety, so that you don't need to use launch all the time. You could basically alternate between all the types of weapons, or the launch, and maybe some other abilities, so that you don't have a dominant strategy using launch. These criticisms are in no way meant to bash or be harsh to Remedy Entertainment. I think they are a truly fantastic studio, and I think Control was an amazing game that truly deserved to win all the accolades it had. This is just an exercise to see how the game could be improved, and I am a truly fan of Remedy Entertainment.